Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today here at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. My name is Rupal Mehta, and I'm the Chair of Research in the Postdoctoral Fellows Program and a Senior Fellow at the Center, and I'll be moderating the lecture today. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome our speaker and a former member of the CGSR team, Ariel Petrovics. Dr. Ariel Petrovics is a research associate and former assistant research scholar and professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, a visiting fellow at the Korbel School at the University of Denver, and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute. Her research examines the effectiveness of foreign policy strategies on nuclear proliferation and international security, and her work has been published in the Journal of Global Security Studies, the Washington Quarterly, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and the Texas National Security Review, among others. She is co-editor and contributing author of Atomic Backfires: Why Nuclear Policies Fail, with MIT Press, which is a forthcoming book that should be coming out in fall of 2025. She earned her PhD in political science from the University of California, Davis, and has held positions as a Stanton Nuclear Security Postdoctoral Fellow and Research Fellow with Managing the Atom and International Security at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Studies. She was also an IGCC Herbert York Fellow and a predoctoral research associate at CGSR. Ariel's talk today explores some new research that she has been working on. While South Korea remains a non-nuclear U.S. ally under the protection of the U.S. nuclear umbrella, domestic support for developing its own independent nuclear weapons arsenal is high and growing. Scientific research and policymakers have increasingly emphasized the risks of new proliferation cascades if South Korea were to cave to these pressures and weaponize, but we don't yet have a complete picture of what motivates this increasing demand or what to do about it. This work contributes by considering how North Korea's choice of nuclear posture, not just its possession of nuclear weapons, can affect public threat perceptions in South Korea and in turn generate pressures to proliferate. Using an original survey experiment, Ariel and her co-authors find that the South Korean public's fears of different military threats are highly sensitive to North Korea's choice of nuclear posture, and that these fears in turn can increase public support for South Korea developing its own independent nuclear arsenal. However, this research also indicates that the public believes an independent South Korean arsenal can effectively mitigate its security concerns. So taken together, Ariel's research suggests that states' nuclear choices continue to influence regional security and proliferation dynamics long after a breakout. This talk will follow the format of other CGSR seminars. Ariel will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will start the Q&A. During her talk, please feel free to get your questions ready, and you can start raising your hands electronically or typing questions into the chat while she is speaking. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ariel, and over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming. I don't want to waste too much of your time, so I want to be able to jump right into this. So let me go ahead and share my screen. I promise we will leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. This is while this paper here that I'm presenting and the results that I'm presenting here is under review. As Rupal mentioned, this is part of sort of a larger project. And so we are actually fielding a second survey experiment shortly. We actually plan to send it out this month. So any comments or suggestions that you have at this point will actually be very useful as we continue to sort of push forward on this problem. So first, this work is based on data from our recent survey experiment, which was conducted in South Korea in late 2022. It's under review for publication now, but since we're preparing to run the second one, any questions you have, even if they don't directly relate to this, but they sort of are tangentially or sort of started to spark your thinking on things, please do sort of let us know. We have an opportunity to try and answer more shortly. So without further ado, this is basically based on, there's a large body of literature in both academic spheres as well as sort of policy spheres that examines sort of what causes nuclear proliferation. In other words, what drives new states to pursue or grow their nuclear weapons program. Not that surprisingly for anyone in this crowd, a major cause, though certainly not the only one, is security concerns, which can be an important impetus for states to seek nuclear weapons. For example, one state nuclearizing can incentivize its rivals to then similarly develop their own weapons to counter it. despite the clear connection here between nuclear fears and proliferation, prior research has not considered how states' postures or how they plan to use the weapons after developing might actually affect proliferation incentives, in other words. So basically, it's not just about do they have nuclear weapons or not. There's other decisions afterwards down the road that can continue to affect this calculus in other states. So we help to fill this hole by asking, how does the nuclear posture of nuclear armed states impact proliferation incentives in their rivals? So to break that down, we're interested in both whether nuclear postures do, because this hasn't really been studied or tested very much in the literature, but also if it does, what causal mechanisms can make posture impact proliferation? Put more simply, if there's a connection, why? So we argue that a nuclear state's choice of its posture can indeed impact proliferation incentives and rivals, in part by driving public threat perception. So what we're looking at here, we kind of dive down into how the public, not just elites, respond to this. And a lot of the times in especially academic literature, but even when we're talking sort of policy in general, there is a bit of this sort of simplifying assumption where you think of any rival as sort of this unitary actor, right? North Korea is just North Korea and it's just Kim Jong-un, which actually in the case of North Korea is not too weird of an assumption to make. But in the case of something like South Korea, one of our very close allies, the public actually does play a very large role, if nothing else, by electing its officials. So we believe that this connection does happen, and that in part it drives these public threat perceptions, which can then increase in response to particular postures, and then they increase the demand for indigenous proliferation, basically to offset that greater threat perception. By no means, we do not argue this is the only way that postures can affect proliferation. There are likely other pathways by which it can do so, but it can be an important pathway. So especially thinking in the case of South Korea, which was sort of our case of interest here. In the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to lay out the logic by which we believe postures can increase those incentives, as well as the different types of threat perceptions specifically that we think are at play. And then I'm going to present the evidence from this original survey experiment we conducted to demonstrate that relationship. And hopefully you will be convinced by the end of this talk as well. So first, nuclear posture in academic literature refers to when and how nuclear armed states plan to use their nuclear weapons. For example, would they plan to use their weapons first in a confrontation? We often call this asymmetric escalation, escalating up the ladder unilaterally or asymmetrically, or a first use posture. Or do they plan to sort of go nuclear only after their adversaries do so in a retaliatory or second strike posture, which is often known as assured retaliation? Note that both of these types are actually intended for deterrence. That means that the states adopt one or the other to maximize their chances of deterring or dissuading their adversaries from using nuclear weapons or from escalating in a conflict. So for example, experts generally agree that Pakistan, and we can all think of this as sort of, there's a obviously very recent case, unfortunately, that would make us think of this. Pakistan has a first use or asymmetric escalation posture. It's one of the reasons why we believe that likely, that the United States and many of the allies got very concerned over this past weekend when it looked like maybe there was some movement by Pakistan against India in the recent conflict. So Pakistan does threaten to use nuclear weapons early in a crisis, and this helps offset its conventional inferiority to its primary adversary, India. While India, on the other hand, has traditionally had a second use or assured retaliation posture, meaning it likely plans to use its nuclear weapons only after its adversary does so in order to reduce Pakistan's first mover incentives. So in other words, both postures are aimed at deterring massive attack from the adversary, but they do so while accounting for their own capabilities and their broader strategic environment. This also means, though, that nuclear posture and the way we use it here is not necessarily the same thing as doctrine or declaratory posture. So by this definition, the US NPR would actually be the US doctrine. It's what the US states it would do. and its official statements about its posture. Although in the case of the US, these two are arguably probably functionally indistinguishable. The same is not always true for regional powers like North Korea that have often made conflicting or impossible statements about their nuclear plans. So assessing posture in this case requires a more comprehensive evaluation of declaratory policy, force posture, technical capabilities. My co-author and I do actually go into a lot more detail on this in another paper that we published in Washington Quarterly in 2022, which I'm happy to share if anyone's interested. But for the sake of time and sort of our more pressing research question here, let's move on then to how nuclear postures affect proliferation incentives in rivals. So let me set the stage for our research with a quick review of the pre-existing work on relationship between nuclear posture and security. So existing work finds that states' choices of nuclear posture can affect its ability to deter adversaries, as well as affect crisis stability or the likelihood that conflicts could sort of escalate out of control. Other work in the case of the Korean Peninsula specifically has shown that South Korean public is largely actually observant of its state's nuclear policy and decisions. And it holds relatively stable and well-formed beliefs about nuclear security. This isn't that surprising, given that unlike the US for the majority of the last 30 years, nuclear weapons and nuclear threats are a common theme in the media and political discourse in South Korea. However, prior work on both the causes of proliferation and the growing body of research on public opinion have not considered the effects of posture. And the sort of basic underlying assumption on a lot of this work is that the public in general, in most places, is largely unaware and ignorant of decisions about posture and similarly technical issues of nuclear policy. So we argue that that's probably actually not the case here, that nuclear postures can indeed impact proliferation incentives in the rival states. And one way that it does so is by affecting public opinion. And specifically, we find that an asymmetric escalation, or that first use posture that I was describing, is likely to increase the rival states' public support for proliferation compared to sort of nuclear choices of an assured retaliation or second strike posture. We believe this occurs because the choice of posture can affect threat perceptions in the rival states' public. In other words, while both postures might be about maximizing deterrence, an AE posture, or that asymmetric escalation one, can be seen as more threatening, and that these fears can then drive demand for reciprocal proliferation to help offset the increased perceived threat. We then disaggregate those types of threats that the public might fear to better understand how nuclear posture can impact perceptions about the conflict escalation ladder. So specifically, we consider the perceived threat of military confrontation by the nuclear adversary, which we could also think about as like emboldenment, even in a more conventional sphere. We also test the perceived threat of a nuclear strike by a nuclear adversary. So that would be like that direct connection between nuclear posture and nuclear use. And finally, we also look at the perceived threat of inadvertent conflict, which gets at the risk of unintentional or unplanned escalation, which could even be driven by the rival state's own decisions rather than those of the nuclear adversary. There are likely other types of threats. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but we focused on these three broad categories here. So the theory that we outlined leads to sort of two important broad hypotheses about the impact of nuclear posture on proliferation incentives. The first, we hypothesize that a first use or asymmetric escalation nuclear posture will increase rival public support for an indigenous nuclear weapon when compared to the nuclear state adopting a second strike posture. And second, we hypothesize that the mechanism behind the positive relationship between a first use posture and proliferation incentives is that a first use posture increases rival public fears about the nuclear state's aggressive intent. So we test these by fielding an online survey experiment on the South Korean public. We used the SINT platform and collected 543 responses. They're balanced across standard demographic controls, including age, gender, education, and income levels. First, though, why do we test in South Korea in particular? We do so to take advantage of the ongoing sort of expert disagreement that was happening at the time on North Korea by priming respondents on different potential postures and then asking for their subsequent views on proliferation. Also, the South Korean public has shown a consistently high support for proliferation, with roughly 70% of the population supporting developing an indigenous nuclear weapon. This makes South Korea a very interesting test case, obviously very policy relevant, as it faces a clear regional nuclear threat. It shows strong domestic support for nuclear weapons development, and it also possesses all of the capabilities necessary to proliferate, but it has not yet pursued a weapons program. So the outcomes of this kind of test are actually relevant to sort of policy decisions going forward. The dependent variable of interest then is the respondent level of support for South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons. But we also then ask a number of follow-on questions to test the mechanisms by which North Korea's posture can affect that support, specifically by impacting threat perception in general, as well as the specific types of threat perceptions that we ask as sort of follow-on questions. We also follow with a number of open-ended questions to help understand why respondents selected as they did. So the respondents viewed an image, an article in Korean that contained a title and then a short vignette designed to look like a news article. This is sort of a sample in the Korean language, but I'll go through the English language translation on the next slide. But all of them basically looked like this. There was only a little bit of variation between those two vignettes. The first respondents, the respondents were randomly assigned to one of these two, and the different groups we do test are sort of balanced across those important demographic controls. The AE, or asymmetric escalation, first use posture vignette claimed that recently North Korea declared it will fire nuclear weapons first before the enemy uses its nuclear weapons in a war. In order to strike first the nuclear weapons, North Korea also announced plans to field tactical nuclear weapons that can be launched rapidly on the battlefield. We vary this in the second strike prime that claims recently North Korea declared it will never fire nuclear weapons first and only fire in retaliation to the enemy's nuclear attack in a war. In order to retaliate with nuclear weapons, North Korea also announced plans to harden its depositories to ensure the survival of our nuclear weapons in the face of the enemy attack. The only variation between these two vignettes were the underlined parts in these two different samples. The rest of the vignettes were identical in both cases, and they hold constant that picture of Kim Jong-un that you saw making a public statement. They also hold constant assurances of coordination between South Korea and its U.S. ally, and claims that experts have corroborated North Korea's new capabilities in both cases. So those are the constants. That this means that the only differences that each side saw were those underlined pieces. They were not underlined in the vignette as you saw in the Korean language version. They're just underlined here so that you can see the variation. So let's take a look at the results of this experiment. What we see first is that the raw differences in means, which is shown here in the histogram, between the response groups support those hypotheses. The group primed with the AE, or first use vignette, had a significantly higher average support for proliferation, and you can see that with the dark box versus the light box. The dark one is asymmetric escalation. The light one there is the assured retaliation or second use posture. So they had a significantly higher support for proliferation, that main DV, and also a higher perception of the North Korean threat. This is sort of the threat in general, compared to the group that was primed with second strike. These differences were both statistically significant, so we can show that the posture does significantly affect both variables. Substantively, though, mean proliferation support was roughly 5% higher in the group that saw a first strike prime, and mean threat perception was about 9% higher. Elections are actually won and lost on much smaller margins than this. And past literature has demonstrated that even a 4% difference is enough to make policy changes within a democratic state, at least, like South Korea. So this suggests that there is a meaningful impact on public interests from even one single prime on North Korea's posture. But threat perceptions and support for proliferation are not two independent preferences, right? Rather, we theorize that the threat perceptions are caused by or help cause the increased support for proliferation. So we next turn to the ways that threat perceptions can then mediate proliferation support. So first, how does priming respondents with a first use posture impact their support for South Korean proliferation compared to priming with that second use posture? As we discussed earlier, we argue that the exposure to the first versus second use directly impacts respondents' perceptions of the threat that they face from North Korea, and that the increased threat that they perceive then contributes to increased support for South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons. So we conduct next a mediation analysis, which uses an ordinal logit through a general structural equation model. I'm happy to go into the details if anyone wants. This is just an excerpt here to sort of show you what you're looking for any of those who don't tend to spend a lot of time staring at these kinds of tables, is those stars. Anything with those stars afterwards means that it's a significant impact. And so what we'll first look at here is row 1. Shows first that exposure to an asymmetric escalation, or that first use prime, significantly increases, right? We see a bunch of stars here and it's a positive number, significantly increases respondent threat perceptions. So this means controlling for a whole bunch of demographics, testing it against with a much more robust model than just sort of like looking at the means. We still see that this relationship holds up. While by comparison, in row 3 at the bottom, it shows an increase in threat perception. That increase in threat perception is quite significant. This also sort of like has good face validity, because what we see is that it increases support for threat, or it increases threat perception, but there is not actually a significant direct relationship between the asymmetric escalation prime and proliferation support. So in other words, we do see that an asymmetric escalation prime significantly drives threat perceptions. It's a pretty large and significant number. And that threat perception does drive proliferation support. Again, this is a positive number, statistically significant, but asymmetric escalation on its own does not drive proliferation support all by itself. In other words, it happens through this causal mechanism as we had theorized. This has good face validity because asymmetric escalation is not really directly related in any way to proliferation. On the other hand, it sort of requires this pathway, a sort of causal mechanism to kind of move this along. This logic is then reflected in some open-ended questions that we then posed. For example, one respondent in the asymmetric escalation group explained that, "I believe that such a declaration to use nuclear weapons first is a direct threat to countries without nuclear weapons." Another one then claimed, "If a burglar threatens me with a knife, I get a knife to balance it out. What's the problem?" By contrast, respondents in the assured retaliation group explained, for example, "Although it's just psychological, this kind of announcement can somewhat reassure South Korean citizens." And then another said, "The reason I oppose developing nuclear weapons is because it can provoke North Korea." In other words, North Korea gives sort of a reassuring announcement. It would look pretty bad to then develop nuclear weapons in response. And so it might be provocative. So let's turn then to how the results of the individual types of threats we tested add a bit more nuance to this story. So the first thing we notice is that all of the differences between assured retaliation in the light gray and the asymmetric escalation in the dark gray are significant, meaning that the confidence intervals, those little bars along the top, don't overlap. This means that nuclear posture is significantly impacting all 3 types of threat perceptions. even those risks that are not directly related to nuclear conflict, like low-level conventional provocation or even inadvertent conflicts. We can also see that regardless of posture, respondents believed that the risk of military threats, military provocation is the highest. So in general, between both of them, military provocation is sort of the highest risk, followed by the risk of inadvertent conflict, and lastly by the risk of nuclear attack, meaning that nuclear attack bars are the lowest compared to the other two groups of bars. This also passes our sniff test, right? It would make sense that respondents think that the likelihood of a nuclear attack is lower than that of a conventional conflict or an inadvertent escalation. However, when we compare between AE and AR effects on the different types of threats, however, we see that nuclear posture has the strongest effect on the perceived risk of a nuclear attack. Again, this kind of makes substantive sense since posture is effectively a signal of when a state's going to use its nuclear weapons. I'm going to then sort of, I just want to lay out sort of a summary of the findings. There is a lot more we can dive into. I'm happy to answer more questions on other parts of this study if you have any, but I do want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So quickly to summarize, we find that nuclear postures can affect regional proliferation risks. So again, there is that positive relationship. The results suggest that a first strike nuclear posture can increase multiple types of threat perceptions and drive proliferation support. This is important because actually shortly after we fielded this study, it ended up being sort of very opportune timing because North Korea did make announcements and then verify some new capabilities that meant that it went from sort of having a very ambiguous posture to a much more settled one. Most experts now agree that North Korea does have a first use posture. So in other words, before North Korea had actually acquired that, we tested what that might do to proliferation incentives in South Korea. Not long afterwards, North Korea did acquire all of the capabilities and then make the announcements necessary to sort of back that up. So they do, in fact, have a first use posture today. As I mentioned, we do plan to field another actually larger experiment very shortly. We want to kind of unpack the issues of proliferation risks and public opinion, and specifically what we're interested in sort of what kind of moves the US and its allies can do that would actually help reduce proliferation incentives in South Korea. So there's a lot of sort of policy tools that we have at hand. Which ones are going to be the most effective at helping drive back down some of these proliferation incentives in South Korea? It is not in US interests to see a South Korea acquire nuclear weapons. So we welcome any suggestions, any feedback you have before we then field our next study. Sort of these are expensive to do. I can't refield it or get the money back once I've done it. So I'm shamelessly using your insights to help improve the study before we actually spend that money. So without further ado, let me go ahead and stop the share, but I can always reopen if there's other slides that people want to see again.